on here with your forecast for May of 2023. This is a monthly forecast, and I would suggest, first thing I'm telling you is you should probably subscribe and get the weekly forecast, which have a lot more to do with how we can navigate our personal lives. The monthly forecast, more or less, has to be about the collective, or, a broader picture. So I think the weekly forecasts are quite helpful. Still, there are some things that when we look at the month as a whole really show up as kind of interesting. Now, the pattern for this month is we start with a lot of tension and things never really get all that quiet. After the first week of the month, we start to mellow out a little bit, but every time we think maybe we're getting mellow, we get another little pop from something all the way through the end of the month. So we've got this really busy month. That's very appropriate for May, springtime for most of us and all of that. So we're going to talk about the collective. I have to say, though, that the more I reflect on it, the more I realize that we can't say too much about the collective in terms of political and social things, because most of the major decisions that had to be made have already been made. What we are experiencing now is the result of decisions that we made at the Uranus-Pluto square in the middle of the last decade and the Saturn-Pluto series, Sun and Mercury, and eventually Jupiter conjunction in Capricorn, square to Eris at the beginning of this decade. And in a big sense, everything that we're dealing with now is the walking out of the decisions that we made at that time. Not that we can't change course, not that we don't have the ability to steer towards better outcomes, but it's hard to steer the collective. It's hard to steer the momentum that we as a whole set for ourselves at these decision points. When the freight train is running downhill, hard to put the brakes on, and it's hard to steer onto another track. And that's why a lot of the stuff that we see doesn't even really resonate with the forecast for a given month, because there's just a little too much momentum going on, and it affects people individually, and we see things showing up individually. Yeah, new stuff comes up, and yes, it does get changed around a bit, but a lot of it, the die has already been cast, so to speak. It's a heavy kind of term, but it really kind of works. Especially, I know most of my viewers are either in the US or the UK, and those two places were very much affected by Pluto's passage through Capricorn. It was a very personal kind of transit for them. The UK is a Capricornian place, and the US had its Pluto return. And so there's a lot of this kind of specific to us kind of energy. But of course, these things resonate all over the world, and you see things happening all over the world. Hot spots in the world are, some of the hottest spots perhaps seem to be outside of the US and the UK. So everybody's dealing with this energy. Everybody's dealing with the pandemic. Come on. But the large extent, the die has sort of been cast and we're walking things out. Still, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens on May 1st when Pluto stations to retrograde. This is his first retrograde station in the sign of Aquarius, and usually that's going to tell us something. And this happens right away on May 1st. But wait a minute, you say, Armand, aren't we in the midst of eclipse season? Didn't we have a solar eclipse just a couple of weeks ago? And isn't a lunar eclipse coming? The answer is yeah. And this Pluto station, it's almost, for practical purposes, for our purposes, we could say it's almost the same as a solar eclipse. In both cases, there's this implosive energy, this ratcheting up of the tension. May or may not find release, but it is a ratcheting up of the tension. But the Pluto station on May 1st, which is going to tell us a lot about Pluto's passage through Capricorn, through Aquarius, is followed by the lunar eclipse on May 5th. And that is a trigger aspect. So what was seeded at the solar eclipse on April 20th and what might be brought to another little level on May 1st by the Pluto station is likely to pop right around the full moon lunar eclipse on May 5th. Pluto station. Now, again, this is telling us about Pluto's time in Aquarius, the collective, how the collective is dealing with things, the empowerment of the collective, and at the same time, perhaps the disempowerment of the collective. You know, who has the power with regards to society? Pluto's going to station to retrograde, and we're going to get to take another look at Capricorn over the coming months. Capricorn felt that it had the power. Now we'll see. We'll see what happens. Keep an eye on what's going on May 1st in the news. By the way, right around the 1st, when we get to, if you're watching this on April 30th or May 1st, May 2nd, right around Pluto stations, there tends to be this kind of ornery, don't bother me kind of energy. So watch out. People are a little bit more. I say that every single forecast, though. People are a little bit, watch out driving. Watch out driving around the 1st. Then on the 5th, we have the lunar eclipse. That's a popping kind of aspect. That is the release of tension. I would be a little careful around then, too. The full moon lunacy gets ramped up. It's not necessarily going to be this really bad problem. Most of us is not going to affect at all. You should watch my video on eclipses and pick out a little bit of why that's the case, but most of us aren't going to be affected at all. Those of us that are affected, it could be a good thing for us individually. But, the general feel of a lunar eclipse full moon is one that is a little out of control, a little bit of lunacy. People are not necessarily on their best behavior. So keep that in mind. But that's the first week of May. We're not looking at people being on their best behavior. Well, I wouldn't just say the first week in May, because on May 9th, the sun meets with Uranus in Taurus. This is another one of those volatile, popping kind of aspects. This is one of those things that will get the potential tension released. So we have the lunar eclipse followed by the Sun-Uranus conjunction. I would have to say that this is makes the 7th and the 9th, really rounds out the first week, from the 5th and the lunar eclipse all the way out to the 9th. It really does take that first week and really lights it up. So we start with tension, we get to release as we move a little closer towards mid-month. During that second week, we have Venus moving into Cancer, which she loves to be in the moon's home sign, just as the moon loves to be in her sign. So Venus loves to be in Cancer, and then she's making nice aspects to retrograde Mercury, and also making a nice aspect to Saturn. That could be a good time for sort of grounding relationship stuff. It could be a good time for, just enjoying yourself with friends and family. That's amidst all of the things that are happening in this time. That's maybe the thing that is the easiest and most direct for us to work with, is just this Venusian energy that's really very supportive. Now, Mercury stations to go direct on the 14th. Okay, here we are right at mid-month, and what do we have with a Mercury station? We have this confusion possibility reaching a bit of a peak. Again, it's not quite as dramatic as it was when Mercury stationed to retrograde on the solar eclipse. Mercury's kind of doing things by himself this time. But be aware that, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th is the time when we're going to get most of the more dramatic Mercury retrograde manifestations, most of the more dramatic manifestations of Mercury. I always do alliterations when Mercury's retrograde. So it's at least a help, too, that for the second half of the month, Mercury will be going direct. As always, give it a little bit of time. Don't rush out to go buy electronics or sign a contract the day that Mercury goes direct. Give them a few days to get up to speed, sometime around the 15th or so. Still, there's stuff coming. It won't affect your contract, but there's stuff coming in this mid-month period that is really worth paying attention to. First of all, Jupiter moves into Taurus, and the first thing that he does a day later is to square Pluto in Aquarius. So Jupiter jumps into Taurus on the 16th. He likes being in Venus's sign. He loved being in Mars' sign, especially at the end of it. But he loves being in Venus's sign. He's, best friends with Venus and all that. And he's comfortable in Taurus, but he's going to square Pluto. First thing he does is square Pluto. You get into this nice green valley of Taurus. And the first thing you do is you get this telegram from Pluto in Aquarius. This is going to be interesting to see how it works itself out. There's a couple of things that I'm thinking about right away. Now, I'm going to do a video for Jupiter in Taurus, and I'll cover this in much more depth then. It'll be released mid-month. It'll be midweek and mid-month. I'll release that video right around Mercury station to go direct. But a little short synopsis of this very important aspect is that Jupiter in Taurus is likely to be referencing our financial systems. And also Pluto in Aquarius represents the power of the collective. Sounds to me like we could be having some very interesting shifts in terms of the economy right at mid-month. I would spend a little extra time looking at cryptocurrency, but I would not spend any money on cryptocurrency with this going on. I think the cryptocurrency and some of those other like NFTs and stuff like that are going to be volatile, let's say. It's a little hard to say for better or worse. My guess is worse, but it's going to be very volatile around this time. Also, you might want to keep an eye on what's happening with our not quite banking crisis. Remember, Pluto's station in Capricorn back in 2008 began the banking crisis. As he gets into Aquarius, as he leaves Capricorn, we had again a reminder of the banking crisis, and now the shift of focus is kind of obvious. We're dealing with how do we regulate, how do we deal with these things. Anyway, I don't want to make too big a deal out of it, but watch for the banking crisis, watch for the economy in general, and keep an eye on cryptocurrency and NFTs and all that sort of stuff. That's one thing for mid-month. The other thing, unfortunately, is that the cycle of Pluto and Jupiter, the Jupiter-Pluto cycle, it's a 14-year cycle, and it has been correlated to international terrorism. That's unfortunate. Of course, we have quite a bit of international terrorism. This is happily a one-off aspect. It isn't like Jupiter and Pluto are going to aspect each other all year or anything. It's a one-time deal, so it probably isn't that dramatic. I would say, though, just worth looking at, this is probably not what you're thinking about, okay? With Jupiter now in Taurus and Pluto in Aquarius, I think that if anything happens in this area, and I hope it doesn't, but if anything happens in this area, I suspect that it's not going to be the usual cast of characters with the usual groups of usual demands. I think this is going to be a different kind of thing. Among other things, this cycle got started back in 2020 with the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn. And so we are getting the next stage of what happened at that time. This is early 2020. A lot happened at that time. Not the usual cast of characters. Like things are going to be a little different. I mean, maybe the usual characters will get in there and do some mischief, but perhaps we'll see something different. Perhaps we won't see anything on that order at all. So this is all going down. Jupiter moves into Capricorn on the 16th, squares Pluto on the 17th. Then a couple of days later, we have the new moon. This new moon happens at 28 Taurus, not quite the last extreme degree, but I would still think that the 19th, when we have the new moon, is a time to see what's going on. Again, it's a time to see what's going on with the same issues of finances and things like that. Perhaps we get one story comes to a conclusion, would be the way I would look at that. 28 and change of Taurus is a pretty dynamic degree. So we'll see what happens with that. A day later, on the 20th, Mars leaves Cancer and moves into Leo. That means two things. It means that when we have this Jupiter-Pluto square and the new moon, Mars is at the very end of Cancer. Now, Mars in Cancer really rallies the cause for clannishness, home, security, that kind of thing. So that's a bit of the vibe that's going to be taking place during this Jupiter-Pluto thing. There's going to be a lot of reactiveness to anything that happens or is perceived to be a risk for happening. We're going to have a lot of reactiveness. That's one thing that's going to go on. And then Mars moves into Leo, favoring more dramatic kinds of actions. And the first thing that he does right there on May 20th, not 12 hours into his stay in the sign of the Lion, is to oppose Pluto in Aquarius. Once again, we have the pop aspect, right? We have this aspect that is just giving us a ton of energy, that is, in a sense, triggering the Jupiter-Pluto square of a few days earlier. So we have, every time we get a little bit, and there's a lot of, I'm not talking about them here because it would be a little too detailed and we wouldn't hold on to them very much, but we have a lot of harmonious aspects sprinkled throughout, but every time we start feeling the harmony, we get something like this. We get this very dramatic aspect. Now, Mars opposite Pluto is an aspect that has potential for some volatile action. Let's just leave it that way. So again, this could be used constructively, and I'm sure that you're going to use it constructively. I'm going to use it constructively. Most of us are going to use it constructively, but some folks are not. So this is another time when you want to be a little bit more careful. This is an aspect that affects us more personally. Jupiter, Pluto, we'll watch and see what happens to the collective. This is an aspect that we can use or be used by. Very good for making statements in public. It is great for creativity. It is great for creativity. Mars at 0 degrees Leo, getting energized by Pluto. It really should be quite strong and quite good for most of us. Some fools are going to mess things up, but that's not you or me, right? Now the sun moves into Gemini, right? The sun moves into Gemini on the 21st, makes harmonious aspects to Mars and Pluto. Maybe we can straighten out some stuff. I mean, again, if you're using this Mars-Pluto opposition to your advantage, this is great because the sun then helps us to get things a little bit more on track. It gets us to help use the energy. That's a tremendous thing. That should be a big advantage for us. So that's a positive. That's a positive. If you're using the Mars-Pluto energy well, the sun comes in and helps out, takes this opposition essentially and turns it into a trine and a sextile and says, look what we can do with all this energy. So right there, 21st, 22nd, things, we can use that in a positive way. Well then, the next thing that comes up is Mars squares Jupiter. Mars squares Jupiter happened on the 23rd, and of course that builds up to the 22nd. And we have Mars at the very first degree of Leo, and we have Jupiter at the very first degree of Taurus. Actually, they're technically they're at 1 degree. So again, very powerful aspect. Mars Jupiter tends to incite us into action. We're in fixed signs, so there could be a little hold in place and then release. But again, this is a release kind of energy, a pop energy, as I keep speaking about. Think about this, though. We have the lunar eclipse this month. That's a popping energy. We have the sun conjunct Uranus, right? Then we have the Jupiter-Pluto energy that is going to be popped and brought out into manifestation by Mars and Pluto, and then we have Mars and Jupiter. Right? So we have a lot of aspects here that just keep the tension going. Every time you think, well, maybe we get a bit of a break, here comes Mars or somebody to cause a little bit more trouble. And the last aspect that we have on May 28th is the sun square to Saturn. Now, this is an aspect that kind of slows down the flow of energy a little bit, but not too much. Not too much, because the sun is in Gemini and Saturn, solid Saturn, is in slippery Pisces. And so, yeah, it's a slowing down of our energy a little bit, but it's not like hitting a wall. Like Sun Saturn aspects often feel like, you're hitting the wall, you're hitting the limitations of what you can do. In mutable signs, it's more like you can't get traction. It's Saturn is trying to slow, but he's slipping around in Pisces, and the Sun is trying to move forward, but he does a pretty good job of that in Gemini, but it's not exactly the easiest place for him to be, making a big stand, because considering different possibilities and stuff like that. So I would look to this time, the 27th, the 28th, as we come into, in the US, that's Memorial Day weekend, I'm pretty sure. Uh, that maybe it would be a good time to kind of let things go and let things slide as we round out the end of the month here. There's a good sense that maybe we can only do so much, and maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we can let things rest a little bit. It's been a pretty dynamic month at this point in time. We've had a lot of opportunities. Any of these aspects I've talked about can be used very productively. Maybe as we get towards the end of the month, it's time to sort of let things go a little bit. And you know what's happening at the same time? Venus in Cancer is making a sextile to Uranus in her home sign of Taurus. And that really suggests a nice social atmosphere, maybe mix things up a little bit, do something a little bit different, move a little bit out of your comfort zone, and that's a nice way to end the month. Anyway, I hope it's a good month. I hope you subscribe, and I will see you next time.